Hi, my name is Ray Crandall. I'm an associate professor at the University of Florida in Gainesville, Florida. This talk, titled Duff and Tree Mortality, is meant to be a general introduction to duff fire science. I originally gave this talk during a duff fire science workshop for the Southern Fire Exchange in Weymouth Woods, North Carolina. I'm re-recording it now because of some technical glitches. We didn't record it on the first take. So let me begin by introducing myself. When a lot of people think of academic researchers, they think of those that are in an ivory tower. And I always want to make the point that my boots are firmly on the ground. I have a long career in fire and fire science, starting with working as a wildland firefighter many years ago. I did that for several years before going on into my academic career. But I'm very fortunate that as part of my career, I'm not just a researcher, but I also am an igniter, and not just an igniter of fires, but also hopefully an igniter of curiosity in the next generation of our fire scientists and ecologists. I teach our fire ecology and management course at the University of Florida. And so not only do I teach about fire, I actually take students out and teach them how to light safe and effective prescribed fire. I know that many of you who are listening to this presentation already know about fire, and fire is probably part of your job and your responsibility, but let's just make sure that we're all on the same page before we get into duff and talk about why we even care about fire in these systems. The southeastern coastal plain, where we find longleaf pine savannas, flatwoods, sandhills, are among the most fire-dependent ecosystems on Earth. Fires historically occurred every 1 to 3 years, especially for sandhills, and about 50% of our longleaf forests now burn far too infrequently. When we burn infrequently, what we see is that this fire exclusion results in hardwood encroachment, takeover of shrubs, and a buildup of fuels. So we have sort of this dilemma here. We need fire, but the first fire after decades can kill trees we've been trying to protect. Most importantly, what we're doing is killing these large old pines. The most ecologically valuable trees are at the most risk when we reintroduce fire into long unburned areas. The high duff that we see when fire has been excluded results in that high mortality risk. But if we don't have fire, we have continued degradation of the system and loss of biodiversity. So this is not a reason to avoid fire. It's a reason to burn smart. And so the fundamental dilemma is that we know these systems need fire. We know the diversity, the structure, the wildlife habitat. It all depends on fire. But when you finally light that torch in a stand that hasn't burned in 30, 40, 50 years, something unexpected can happen. The biggest, oldest trees, the ones you want to keep, can die. And not just a few. In some documented cases, more than 50% of large overstory pines died after a single reintroduction fire. So what's the mechanism? What's killing these trees? And that's what we're going to unpack today. And the answer almost always comes back to one thing: duff. Let's talk about what duff actually is, because it's one of those things that most people can smell and feel, but really haven't thought much about. And when I say smell, I mean, to me, duff smells really great. I wish we could bottle it into some sort of perfume or cologne because it has this rich, organic, almost sweet scent. So if you've ever dug down through pine needle litter to the dark, spongy layer below, that's duff. It's partially decomposed stuff where you can kind of still see what it is, but it's not fully decomposed yet. It's dark, it's this homogeneous layer. It's sort of the same thing if you have a compost pile. You turn your compost pile pretty regularly, or most people do, and underneath that top layer where you can still see, okay, there are the eggshells from the eggs I had for breakfast and that sort of thing. But once you dig down a little bit deeper, you might see a partial piece of an eggshell, but you see that it's this dark, rich, decomposed or partially decomposed matter that's below that top layer. It's the same thing in long unburned longleaf pine stands. So this duff accumulates over decades. Here's the critical part. Duff doesn't just accumulate evenly across the forest floor. It concentrates in mounds at the base of old trees. So we're talking 5 to 50 centimeters deep, right at the base of the tree. And where it gets dangerous for the tree is that over time, the tree's fine roots actually grow up into the duff, and the duff becomes the root habitat. So when duff burns, those roots burn with it. So when we think about these roots, well, okay, do we really care about these little roots that have grown up into the duff? Don't pines have lots of roots? Well, they have tap roots. So that's that dominant, deep growing vertical root that's used to anchor the plant. And we see here in the photo to the right, a gentleman who is touching that large taproot that's going far into the ground. Well, pines also have feeder roots, shallow, hair-like roots at the top 12 centimeters of soil. They do most of the hard work in terms of absorbing water and absorbing nutrients, and so they're really important. In fact, most plants rely primarily on the feeder or lateral roots. Those are the roots that are growing up into the duff. Those tap roots really come more into play during droughts. In fact, you can often see these feeder roots in the duff layer. And if you dig down in this photo, you can sort of see them. You can see these fine little roots that are up out of the soil, but in that duff or that partially decomposed organic layer. So you may think, oh, I lit this prescribed fire in this long unburned area, and the fire actually moved pretty quickly. And in most systems that are burned frequently, it does. And that's the hot, fast, brief flame that moves through, and it's done very quickly. You see in this graph in the top that the duration of time that a fire is above 60 degrees Celsius is actually extremely short in a frequently burned area. But in a long unburned area, we see that flaming front go through, but what remains are smoldering fires. Those are the slow, steady fires. There's no flames. They're actually kind of hard to detect that they're even occurring in many cases unless you use an infrared camera. And these smoldering fires can burn for hours or even days. And we see this in the bottom graph on this slide, where in the long unburned, we see a long duration of those smoldering fires, and especially basil. So basil is what we would consider like right underneath a tree, which is where most of that duff accumulates. So not only do we see the smoldering, but we also see the smoldering occurring right at the base of trees. So it's not the fire per se that damages the trees, it's really the duration. And it's having those fires there for a really long time. I always think of this as, say if you burn your hand, if you touch something that's really hot, say you're cooking or something, and it's sort of that hot potato, you're juggling the hot potato or whatever. If you're juggling the hot potato, you're not really, burning yourself because you're just barely touching that potato. But if you were to grab a potato that had just come out of the oven and actually hold on to it, you're going to experience a pretty significant burn. It's the same thing with those roots. If they only experience that fire for just a moment, you're unlikely to kill those feeder roots. But if the fire remains and it smolders for a long period of time, then you're likely to incur damage on those feeder roots. I just want to drive this point home by showing you this infrared photograph that really shows how hot these areas can get in long unburned sites. Now, as we saw in the previous graph, in a frequently burned site, there's almost no lethal heating underground. The thin litter layer burns really fast and the soil is barely affected. But in long unburned areas, temperatures above 60 degrees Celsius, this is the threshold lethal to plant tissue, were sustained for several hours at a depth of 10 centimeters. 10 centimeters below the mineral soil surface. And at the surface itself, temperatures above 300 degrees Celsius were reached. That actually persisted for over 30 minutes. Temperatures above 300 degrees Celsius are actually hot enough to affect soil nutrients. So in these long unburned areas, that's not a surface fire, that's an underground oven running for hours. And it's happening silently after your visible flame has moved through. Understanding how duff got there really helps us understand what we're dealing with. In a frequently burned system, there's almost no duff. It's just a thin litter layer. Fire consumes it before it can accumulate. But if you exclude fire for even 10, 15, or more years, it really begins to build up. For decades, it keeps building and deepening, especially right at the base of old trees where bark sloughs off, needles fall, and it creates ideal conditions. The duff right at the base of the tree, the basal duff, is deeper and often drier than duff in the openings between trees. The canopy intercepts rainfall. The bark and the base of the tree create a dry microclimate. So the most dangerous duff, the duff most likely to ignite and smolder deeply, is right where it can do the most damage to those feeder roots. So what is your single best predictor of how much duff you're dealing with? Time since last fire. The longer it's been, the deeper the problem. Let me walk you through a landmark experiment conducted at Eglin Air Force Base in the Florida Panhandle. Morgan Varner and colleagues took 16 fire-excluded longleaf pine stands, each about 10 hectares, and burned them under carefully controlled conditions based on duff moisture. Some were burned when the duff was very wet, some when it was moderately moist, and some when it was dry. Researchers went back several weeks after the fire and they did not observe any initial mortality. And then they returned again about every 6 months. And what they found was that mortality was really delayed. And so it was really not until about 18 to 24 months after the fire before mortality was observed. In the dry burns, about 20% of the overstory pines died. In the wet and moist burns, the mortality was no different from the unburned control at about 2 to 3%. So there were really two critical findings from this study. First, how much duff was consumed was the best predictor of which individual trees died. And second, and this is really important for managers, most of the mortality did not show up right away. It was delayed 18 to 24 months after fire. The trees looked fine at first, and then later they died. That delayed death matters for management. You can't do a post-burn assessment the next week and think you're in the clear. You can think of this mortality in terms of this classic cartoon, the Roadrunner, where the Roadrunner pushes Wile E. Coyote off of the cliff, and Wile E. Coyote hangs there for just a second before falling. Well, fire in a long unburned stand is like the Roadrunner, and Wile E. Coyote is that pine tree. Okay for a few minutes, okay for even up to a year, and then we see that delayed mortality. Not only do we see delayed mortality, but we also find that the biggest and oldest trees, the ones that you might expect to be most resistant, are actually most likely to die. In the Eglin experiment that I described earlier, they found trees over about 40 centimeters in diameter had over 50% mortality in the dry burns. Smaller trees were at about 19%. Why? Because larger, older trees have had more time to accumulate bark, cones, and litter at their bases. They have larger, deeper duff mounds with more roots colonizing them. There's more fuel around them and more to lose when it burns. For RCW managers, for old growth advocates, for anyone trying to maintain large legacy pines, this finding is really significant. The trees you most want to protect are the ones most at risk. This is a reason to be very strategic about reintroducing fire into long unburned areas. Let's talk mechanism. How exactly does this play out physiologically? Because it's important for you to understand that it's not a direct kill, it's more of a cascade. When duff smolders at the base of a tree, lethal temperatures move down through the duff layers and into the mineral soil. Fine roots living in the duff are killed directly by heat, and then the coarse roots deeper in the mineral soil may be killed indirectly. Because when the fine roots are killed, they are connected directly to these coarse roots. And so the coarse roots effectively lose their tips and they end up dying too. So this has been tracked over time after a wildfire, and researchers found a critical threshold. So when about 30 to 40% of the forest floor was consumed during a fire, sap flow in the tree dropped very significantly. The tree simply couldn't get enough water to its canopy. The tree then starts burning up its carbohydrate reserves. This is basically its savings account. It can maintain the appearance of health for months or even a year or more, but it's slowly starving. And especially in drought years, when it needs more of those reserves, there's simply nothing left. So this explains the delayed mortality pattern that we often see after reintroduction fires. The tree isn't dead the day after the fire, it's mortally wounded, and the visible death comes much later. Surviving a duff fire doesn't mean the tree is fine. A 2016 study by Slack, Varner, and colleagues followed longleaf pines for 10 years after experimental smoldering fires at Ordway Swisher Biological Station in Florida. They found that even trees that lived showed reduced growth during drought years, and this was for up to a decade after the fire. Their carbohydrate reserves were depleted, their resin duct production, which is a key defense against bark beetles, was also reduced. So the damage from a single bad fire can ripple through the years. A tree that looks fine may be quietly vulnerable, especially when droughts hit. Not all duff ignitions happen the same way. So Cry, Varner, and others showed that pine cones and coarse woody debris act as ignition vectors. So by that I mean as an ignition vector, that they bridge the flaming fire front and the duff. So cones with their high resin content and complex structure can smolder intensely and transfer that heat into the smoldering duff at moisture contents where the duff itself wouldn't normally ignite. So this has management implications. First, it means duff can ignite even when overall moisture conditions seem relatively safe. Second, it means the pattern of duff consumption is heterogeneous. You're going to see that duff consumption is the highest near tree bases where these cones are present and where bark has sloughed off and where woody debris concentrates. So when you do mop up, it's really important to focus on vector fuels, the cones and the coarse woody debris near the bases of trees that will help ignite the duff. Research has shown us that duff moisture content is the single most important variable to consider when you're reintroducing fire. Duff moisture content above 85% dramatically reduces your risk of having tree mortality during reintroduction fires. The Eglin experiment that I described earlier showed that wet and moist burns, so we're talking about duff moistures of 85% or above, resulted in no more tree death than not burning at all. So the damage threshold corresponds closely to when the duff gets dry enough to sustain smoldering. And we find that to be around 55 to 60% of soil moisture. Earlier work by Ferguson and colleagues in 2002 showed that 3 to 4 inches of rainfall in the previous 2 days essentially eliminates residual smoldering. So that might be your rule of thumb for some field conditions. Now, duff moisture is harder to predict than litter moisture. It buffers against drying, but it also buffers against wetting. It responds to regional drought conditions, seasonal patterns, and microsite effects. But the bottom line for precipitation planning is clear. You need wet duff before you burn safely in these stands. Okay, so we know we want wet duff. How do you actually assess that in the field before igniting a reintroduction fire? So I'm going to give you a few practical tools or guidelines that you might follow. First, you can consider KBDI. It gives you a regional sense of how dry the landscape is. The threshold varies by site, season, and soil type, but keeping KBDI below about 200 is a reasonable starting point for first burns in these long unburned systems. Second, you can look at cumulative rainfall. That 3 to 4 inch threshold that I mentioned from Ferguson and colleagues is a useful field metric. If you've had significant multi-day rain recently, you're certainly in better shape. Third, you can use a handheld pin moisture meter. These are relatively inexpensive tools that can give you field spot checks on duff moisture. They're not perfect, but they're certainly useful. One critical caveat from all of the research is that duff moisture is spatially variable. The basal duff right at the base of trees is deeper and often drier than the duff in openings. So you need to check at the base of trees, not just in the open areas, and check the lower duff because that's where the smoldering will actually be sustained. The goal is not to eliminate all duff in one burn. It's to reduce it gradually. You want conditions where your fire will carry through the herbaceous fuels and accomplish your restoration goals, but where the duff is wet enough that smoldering is limited. So you might target windows after significant rainfall, ideally in front of another rain event. If you can burn at night, do it. Cooler temperatures and higher humidities help protect the duff. And be conservative with your prescription for the first several burns in a long unburned area. And here's the key mindset. You're not trying to eliminate all the duff in a single burn. You're trying to reduce it incrementally, a little more each burn, while keeping your trees alive. Slow and steady wins this particular race. When reintroducing fire into a long unburned area, you want to use patience and perspective. You can make meaningful progress in a decade or so. You don't need fire to do all of the work, and that's an important point. Natural decomposition is still happening between burns. Duff is not static. It's being broken down over time, and that decomposition is working with the fires. It's important not to get anxious and to push the prescription when conditions aren't right. 3 burns in 10 years or 4 burns in 10 years are not that different in the long arc of restoration, but one burn under dangerously dry conditions can set you back years and eliminate the trees you're trying to protect. It's also advised to use duff pins. I use the pins that you might put in landscaping cloth, very simple pins, or stakes even work driven into the duff, and you can monitor then the duff depth over time and celebrate those incremental achievements. This is really a marathon and not a sprint. In long unburned stands, mop up is not something you do if you have time. It should be part of the prescription. Plan for it, budget for it, staff for it. And it might take days. So you might have to dedicate resources for 2 or 3 days after burning long unburned units. Focus on the tree bases, the coarse woody debris, and pine cone accumulations. The vector fuels that we talked about earlier. Those are where the smoldering will persist long after the flame front has passed. One technology that's been developed that's really been useful is a handheld thermal camera, including even the consumer grade units like the FLIR One that attaches to a phone. It allows crew members to see hotspots that are invisible to the eye, and you can walk through a unit the next morning and identify exactly where the smoldering is still occurring in duff that looks cold from the outside. Before you burn a unit with large trees you can't afford to lose, identify those trees, know where they are, and then those should be your mop-up priorities. Let me consolidate the key management points. Before you burn, check your drought indices, verify recent rainfall, sample the basal duff moisture directly at the tree bases, and know where your most important trees are. Now, for those most important trees, you might want to commit crew to doing mop-up around them, but you might also want to prepare them before the burn. I don't recommend raking around these trees that you want to protect because raking will also damage those feeder roots around trees. But a leaf blower works really well to clear some of that fuel and duff around the base of trees. So during and immediately after the burn, you want to consider timing the burn in front of incoming rain when possible. Consider night ignition if you can, because that will often reduce smoldering. And keep your eyes on the tree bases as the fire moves through. After a fire, consider doing a thermal camera sweep within the first 24 hours. Focus mop up on the basal zones and those vector fuels, and then set a reminder to monitor the crown health for the next 2 years because delayed mortality will often occur. In the long term, commit to the program, multiple burns under the right conditions, tracking duff depth, potentially with pins, and using a lot of patience. There are 5 things I want you to take away from this talk. First, duff, which is that partially decomposed layer, kind of a spongy layer at the base of trees, is the critical fuel when we consider reintroducing fire into long unburned areas. Second, smoldering combustion, not open flame, is typically what causes tree mortality. It can occur silently below ground for hours. Third, your biggest, your oldest trees, the ones that you most want to save, are the most vulnerable. So you need to plan to protect those trees. Fourth, duff moisture is really important. It controls everything. Burn when the duff is wet, and you can dramatically reduce tree mortality. And fifth, this is a long game. Patience, doing incremental burns is much better than rushing a single burn that might cause high tree mortality. If you have any questions about duff or duff burning, feel free to contact me. All of my contact information can be found by searching my name or going to my lab website, which is ecologyonfire.com. Thank you.